Okay, hello, everyone. Welcome to the HKIUD webinar with our theme being local to global, urban design narratives from around the world. I'm Maysho Prashad. I'm actually talking to you from NEOM, Saudi Arabia, and I'm a senior development manager and an HKIUD member. And I have the privilege today to really host Peter of SOM, and he will be delivering on the subject of biometric urbanism, nature-based design. Just to sort of give you a little bit of how it goes, Peter will deliver his presentation, and then we will have an opportunity to have a panel discussion and some Q&A, which we hope that you can submit your questions and we'll get them answered by Peter based on the presentation. So as an introduction to Peter, Peter is a California-based architect and urbanist and a principal leading SOM city design practice in the Western United States. He was the former director of SOM Hong Kong studio. He has over 25 years of experience designing mixed-use projects throughout the world, specializing in sustainable integration of architecture, transportation, and landscape systems. Peter will be presenting his research into biomorphic urbanism, an approach to urban design that advocates for ecology and culture of place, primary driver of civic form making. He will present his work on The Point, which is in Utah, and other projects which incorporate the principle of biomorphic urbanism. Projects to which Peter has contributed have received numerous international, national, and local design awards from the Urban Land Institute, the American Institute of Architects, the American Society of Landscape Architects, the U.S. Green Building Council, and the Congress for New Urbanism. His work and writing have been featured in prominent media outlets, including Bloomberg, Fast Company, National Geographic. I'm very happy that Peter is with us, and I'm looking forward to the talk. Over to you, Pete.
All right, thank you, Maysho. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Great. Well, thanks for that nice introduction. I am really excited to be here and speak to you all today. As Maysho mentioned, I was based in Hong Kong for almost 4 years, and I see there's a couple folks on the Zoom from our old studio, Xavier Chan and others. So I'm thrilled to be back speaking with you. I do want to speak on a couple of topics today: biomorphic urbanism, as Maysho said, show you a little bit of our recent research in North America development trends, and then show a few case studies. So I'll try and move through this in about 40 minutes or so. Please feel free to ask questions at the end. I'd love to engage with you all on these topics. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about U.S. urbanization trends, since the lecture is also focused on these different geographic regions. And some of these slides are from a recent meeting we had at SOM, which looked at markets in North America, specifically the Sun Belt. But we were talking quite extensively about the global population and what that means. Last November, we hit 8 million people in the United States, and the global population continues to grow at about 1% per year. So I think as urbanists, it's really important that we understand how our work is impacting this population and how we can create a more sustainable planet. In the US, we are seeing an increase in population, as you can see on the right, in the last 40 or 50 years. And by 2060...
Yeah, sorry, Pete, I don't see your screen. Is that so
sorry.
too?
Hold on. I thought I was sharing. Okay. Got it?
Yes, got it.
We missed the first couple of slides if you want to go back, Pete.
Okay. Sorry about that. So So this was the slide on population. Last November, we hit 8 billion people, and the population globally has continued to grow. In the United States, we're seeing a change in the profile of the population. As in many countries, the population is getting older as the population grows. So a little overview of the United States. It's a very diverse geographic region, but has a variety of different climates within it, much like Asia. Tremendous wind potential in different parts of the country, also hydro potential, intense and extensive river systems that mark the United States. As some of you may have heard, we've had over the last few years a series of wildfires, particularly in the American West, which you can see here. And the result of that is also a degree of water scarcity. So we're seeing more droughts in the US West. In the middle of the country, which is more temperate, we are seeing some effects of agriculture and its impacts on the water system. This is really our breadbasket of North America. And then, of course, some other impacts from climate change is sea level rise, which you can see on our coastal areas, and simultaneously in the south and east of the United States, hurricane risk. So we were looking at a lot of these trends at our recent SOM firm-wide meeting. The population of the United States is also trending south and west, as this diagram shows. So people are moving away from the traditional employment centers and big cities of the East. And this series of diagrams illustrates that, where you can see the population in 1940. And in 1960, you can see these increasing cities. And gradually, you can see that the population in 1980, and then moving forward to 2020, the population has really migrated to the south and west, specifically California on the left, Texas in the south at the bottom of the screen, and then Florida at the lower right. So these population shifts are all important trends. We're seeing higher growth rates in some of these southern cities. And here's a specific city by city mapping of where we're seeing population growing. We're specifically interested from a development perspective in what we call the Sun Belt. So the yellow line indicates the Sun Belt, and below that line is a warmer climate, typically, and some of these climate impacts really have a greater effect down there. Economically, the South is also an area of low taxes, so it tends to attract new development, new employment. You can see the blue indicates higher employment opportunities. And from our technology sector, you can see in the purple has the highest number of startups, technology startups in the country. So California, of course, well known for that. But many of these companies now are relocating to Florida, Texas, and other states. I think what's interesting about trends in the United States is that the infrastructure in the country is also moving along with population. So we're seeing some of the fastest growing airports in the south and west part of the country in the blue circles. We do have a fairly extensive rail network in the United States, nothing like, say, what China's building, but rail does exist, and slowly we're moving towards a better rail service that begins to address some of these new growth areas in the United States. From a transit perspective, which is always important to urbanization, we're seeing higher growth rates again in California in particular. Now, recently, about a year ago, the U.S. Congress passed what was called the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which was a major spending package for new infrastructure. And you can see that a majority of that money was directed to the southern part of the United States. So again, this idea of reinforcing key growth areas in the US. Some of the challenges we're facing in the country from an urbanization perspective are mobility, trying to create more varied forms of transportation. We're also seeing higher densification in cities like Austin, Texas, which you can see here, just in 40 years, 30 years, what's occurred in Austin. Because land is fairly cheap in the United States, there are increasing pressures on rural areas. But those rural areas often also have the highest risk, either for water shortages or wildfire, as you can see on the left. Typically, the United States has been dependent on car transportation as the primary means of transportation, but we are seeing some of that begin to change. Sprawl.
Pete, apologies. Someone mentioned that they're not able to see your screen full. Is it
okay.
full?
Yeah, I'm in full screen mode.
Okay. All right.
Let me see
that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine, Pete. Sorry, go on.
Okay. This is a typical example of what we call sprawl, which is generally low density development. And you can see the change in about 20 or 30 years in this particular instance in Texas. Water is one of the big challenges in these emerging growth areas in the United States. We are seeing new pressures on our water systems. And then cultural integration. Just like many parts of the world, the United States has significant indigenous populations, traditional cultures that were here before European settlement. So there's an increasing interest in incorporating many of these traditions and cultural components into the planning of our new cities. Climate change continues to impact the United States, just like it is globally. Here you see recent heat waves in 2023, and even just in the next 2 years, it's estimated that potentially 2/3 of the United States may experience some sort of heat-related event. So that's quite concerning. And so our cities need to adapt to these new realities. We are seeing some interesting innovations in urban design in the US. This is a project in Dallas, Texas, a new park over a freeway called Clyde Warren Park. So some of these existing automobile infrastructure elements are being reimagined as civic space. And this is just one example of many of these types of projects that are going on in the US. We are seeing additional and new investment in high-speed rail in California on the left, in Texas, and then in Phoenix and Florida. SOM recently completed this project in Florida, which is a new transportation corridor based on rail that connects some of Florida's major cities. There's also an increasing interest in regional architecture and regional expression, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the biomorphic section of the presentation. The South and West have always been areas of innovation around planning and urban design. This is Seaside, which is now about 40 years old, a famous project here in the US that really started the conversation around walkable communities and other types of new innovations in urbanism. This is a really interesting project being constructed in Phoenix, Arizona called Cul-de-sac, which is a car-free community. You can see on the right, it's currently under construction. It's not very big, but I think there's a lot of innovative ideas that will be realized on this project. And then finally, some innovations in mixed use developments. So we're seeing downtowns of US cities being transformed from, say, primarily work environments to live, work, and other types of land uses occurring downtown. On the left is Frank Gehry's new mixed use project in Los Angeles. So I just want to leave this section of the presentation with a note about where the US continues to urbanize and continues to grow. And we are trying to address these urbanization challenges in these new areas of growth, particularly in the South and West. So you can see that the trend from a city planning standpoint really is away from the establishment cities of the East Coast and the North and moving into exciting new smaller cities in general to the South and West. So the second part of the presentation is on this topic that I've been interested in called biomorphic urbanism. And it really was stimulated actually by a project we did in Jakarta, Indonesia, where our client said, we really want something that will represent this particular place. We don't want our project to look like every other place in the world. And that started me thinking about the idea of place and what it means to be specific to a particular area or region. I came up with the proposition that place really is defined by two primary elements: the ecosystems of a particular location, what the climate is, and then also the cultural influences. So that really became this theory of biomorphic urbanism, and it's based on a little bit of what's called biophilia, which I think many of you have heard of, which is this inherent human attraction to nature, this idea of bringing nature into our buildings and into our cities. Also was influenced by biomimicry, this notion that we can learn from nature, that we can mimic some of the components of nature. But I felt that perhaps this wasn't quite sufficient for some of the large-scale planning issues that we were facing as an urban designer. And so I worked on this idea with my colleagues in Hong Kong and elsewhere, but around biomorphic, and it's simply the combination of two words, life, bio meaning life, and form, morphic meaning form. And the proposition is that biomorphic cities are shaped by both natural and cultural systems. And that really starts to, I think, allow us to understand each place individually. Why is New York different from Paris, for instance, or Hong Kong different from, say, Muscat, Oman? If we begin to really understand these two contributors, we can begin to more distinctly define what makes a place unique. So a few corollaries that go along with this idea, that these two systems, natural and man-made, are two very distinct systems. But each of them are important, and each has a specific purpose, and each has a specific value. So we need to be able to understand both of these inputs simultaneously. And sometimes when we hybridize them is potentially to actually, I would say, diminish both of them. So we have to be very conscious of how we bring nature and our built environment together in a way that allows each of them to fulfill their maximum potential. I think what really concerned me as I've worked around the world is the treatment of how we think about infrastructure. This is the Los Angeles River, which was channelized. We see a lot of this around the world. So how do we begin to bring some of these natural systems, these rivers and wetlands, back into a more prominent position in our thinking around cities. So the goal is to design cities that allow both of these systems to be foregrounded. So when we talk about ecological systems, it's really pre-settlement conditions. So that's hydrology, water systems, animal habitats, topography, climate, all of these components of the natural world that were in place before we started to build. And then cultural systems, or what I sometimes call anthropomorphic systems, are the things that we build, the important components of our cities and our neighborhoods. So these two components should be considered separately, and then we begin to think consciously about how to bring them together. So biomorphic urbanism is really about complementarity. How do these two different systems begin to be interrelated? This is a project we did in Indonesia, Jakarta, called Pluit City. But my biomorphic urbanism, I think, has a number of interesting characteristics. It's very specific to its place, obviously. That's the fundamental premise and goal of thinking this way, that we can learn from the individual places in which we work, that it's what I call granular, meaning it's scaled for people, not, say, cars or large transportation systems. Biomorphic urbanism is additive, meaning that the more we build, this relationship should be more enhanced, should be better. It also has the benefit of bringing people together. They tend to be the places that we build where people can interact with both the natural world and the built world. And then it's restorative. I think that's really a fundamental goal of biomorphic urbanism, is that it begins to restore some of these natural systems that have been compromised through urbanization. And then the idea that a designer has a specific role in this process, that we all as designers have a specific role in designing intentional places, clear places. And finally, transportation. How does transportation fit into this? And I suggest that our transportation systems and mobility systems really should be complementary to these other two components of our cities. And I think, unfortunately, over the last 40 or 50 years, our cities have been led by transportation. So we had the opportunity in 2019 to test out some of these ideas with National Geographic, which was really exciting. They approached us and asked if we would do a future city for one of their magazine issues. And so we organized some folks from our studios, and we presented this future city to National Geographic around 10 principles, which you see here bolded. And these 10 principles are principles that we use here at SOM to guide our work. And we found that beneficial in terms of how we further understand the complexity of cities. For National Geographic, we looked at 5 different scales. And I think that's an important characteristic of biomorphic urbanism, is that it's actually applicable at multiple scales. So this is the region. We looked at agriculture and its relationship to cities. And if you'd like to learn more about this National Geographic project, I believe it's still available from National Geographic. The second scale was urban hubs. And we looked at how specific projects or development efforts could be organized around these more organic natural systems. So here you see that. And then the third scale was the district scale, where we looked at specific neighborhoods. And in this instance, we looked at it in sections. So we wanted to explore sectionally, vertically, how this higher density integration would work. Now, for National Geographic, as you can see here, we did propose a fairly dense future city. But one thing that's also interesting about biomorphic urbanism is it can work at multiple densities. It's not only a high density concept. And then the final two scales are shown here, the buildings on the left and the dwelling unit on the right. And we looked at what we called now and next. So where are we today with some of these sustainable ideas, and where will we be in 2050, which was the date that we set for this future city for National Geographic. So that was a really fun project to kind of test some of these ideas, and just a bit more on biomorphic urbanism. So after the National Geographic project, I developed this process a bit more. So the two fundamental goals of biomorphic urbanism is to restore native ecosystems and strengthen social and cultural connectivity. And that really has led to a method of practice. And I think what was interesting about the 20th century was that these two ideas, ecology and urbanization, really were considered separate, and they were moving in opposition to each other. They were moving away from each other. We would think on the left about natural systems as separate from infrastructure, which was in the middle. And then on the right, urbanization and cities and buildings. So we never really thought much about how these ideas could complement each other. So biomorphic urbanism is really about bringing these two elements back together, this idea of urbanization and ecological health. And I think what's exciting, and probably you're seeing this too, Maysho, in Saudi Arabia and other places in Asia, Tim, and Hong Kong urban designers, that a lot of these ideas are actually being implemented today, and they, in some degree, have always been part of our practice. But I think we're seeing a renewed focus on these topics. So biomorphic urbanism is a flexible framework to restore ecological health and strengthen social connectivity. And the way to measure it is by what I call the restorative benefit. So when you look or think about a project, what is the restorative benefit that project may have around ecology and culture? So a little bit on the process. So on the left is ecological systems that we want to protect and restore, and cultural systems that we want to strengthen. And the anthropomorphic systems are the physical elements that we actually build as designers. And these three elements should be complementary and supportive of each other. So the things that we build actually, again, restore and strengthen some of the cultural systems and ecological systems that we are interested in preserving. And you can think of it as a sliding scale. There's no one particular definition of what a biomorphic project is. It's really dependent on the goals of a particular city or the ecosystems in which that city is situated. For instance, Singapore on the left is really quite advanced in terms of its thinking around ecology, whereas, say, a city like Manhattan has pretty much erased most of its ecological history, but that is being reimagined, especially in New York and many US cities. And I think this notion of the relationship between what we build and the ecosystems in which we build have always been part of how people think about cities. If you look at old maps of cities, they always draw the ecosystems and natural features around that city. It was an intrinsic part of how they imagined their place in the world. And if you look at some of the older maps, like this one of Los Angeles, what I always find quite interesting about these older maps is you can see the grid of the city, but you can also see equally as well the mountains and the rivers and the coastline. So it's really a balanced understanding of how cities grow. And coming back to scale, this is Vancouver, looking at the region of Vancouver, Canada, which is the city is in the upper left. But again, some of this older mapping shows topography, shows wetlands in these in this blue color, the river systems, of course, and then this emerging city in the upper left, the grid of streets. And as you zoom in a little bit closer, there's more detail. So again, I think it's worthwhile to understand holistically how cities are structured. And somebody mapped Vancouver's old rivers on top of their city plan, which you can see here. In most of these rivers, just like many cities, have been erased from the urban environment, put into pipes or put underground. So perhaps the future is about restoring some of these streams, which of course feed into the wetland systems and estuaries of the adjacent water. So these are still very important systems, but they've been erased. And then we can then translate some of that understanding to our actual project. So districts on the left, infrastructure in the middle, and buildings on the right. So the process of biomorphic urbanism is really 3 stages or phases. One is understanding what was there before, so documenting ecological and cultural precedents. Secondly is the planning or design phase, where you begin to really map where you want to build and where you don't want to build to enhance ecology in the first place. But then thinking about where you do build, what type of development you want to have, and how that's reflective of the particular culture of the place. And then phase 3 is really about what I called implementation here, but it's really about the connecting of these places together through transportation systems and other types of mobility connections, as well as technological connectivity. Excuse me. So I thought I'd wrap up with just a few case studies on biomorphic urbanism projects. These are projects you've probably seen before in some cases. One project that SOM's been working on is a relatively modest project in Chicago called the Wild Mile. Here you see Chicago in the background. This is on the north branch of the Chicago River. And the proposition was pretty simple. It was just to create a design strategy that allows that river edge to be restored in a somewhat light touch, but no less effective in terms of its impacts on the waterway. So it's actually a floating boardwalk, as you can see here. But what was important about this was really just reimagining the Chicago River as an asset rather than something that we turned our back on. The Chicago River had been channelized, as you can see, by these steel walls on the left-hand side of this picture. So this is allowing people to access the river again, which is an important part of this idea. And then the kids on the left are building these little floating rafts, which allow plants to grow on top of those rafts, and also underneath the rafts provide shelter for aquatic animals, fish in particular. So again, a relatively modest effort. This will be extended further over time, but it does show how these ideas can be implemented in a relatively inexpensive manner. Another project that I thought was representative of some of these ideas was Bjarke Ingels's Big U, which I imagine you've all seen. It's been out for a few years now. This has certain biomorphic attributes. One is an acknowledgement of sea level rise, which this is intended to address. It incorporates a series of parks into the building of this protective levee, essentially around Lower Manhattan. So you're getting this combination again of social spaces and infrastructure brought together in a very creative manner. So we're meeting the needs of cities to address climate change, but also strengthening social connection and cultural alignments with the places in which we're building. Another project in New York is what's called Fresh Kills Park or Fresh Kills Landfill. Again, an older project, but it's a park that's about 2.5 times the size of Central Park, so very big. It's on Staten Island, to the south of New York City, of Manhattan. This was an old landfill, and of course, this landscape was really treated quite poorly, even though it was a high-value estuary and wetland in New York originally. So James Corner Field Operation was the author of this plan, and they reimagined the Fresh Kill site as a new ecosystem, essentially. So the landfill remains, but they have reimagined how that may evolve over time. So this rendering is quite nice. You can see the tidal wetlands in the foreground, the estuary, the wetland plantings that offer a transition from the marine environments to the terrestrial environments, replanting of some of those original species, bird life, and then also activities for people that want to enjoy this park. And I think it's important to think about not only terrestrial environments as we think about ecosystems, but also marine environments. Northerly Island is a case study in Chicago. Some of you may know this one as well. Chicago had an airport on its lakefront, and this is a very large lake, Lake Michigan. And the airport was decommissioned, and Jeannie Gang was hired to develop a master plan for this island. Here you see the island relative to downtown Chicago. So it was actually part of the 1909 plan of Chicago that Daniel Burnham authored. And he had envisioned this as an island that was for recreation. But over time, it had been converted to an airport. So Jeannie Gang imagined the redesign of this island, essentially peninsula, as a new park, and to really bring back some of the original shoreline ecosystems of Chicago and the Great Lakes area. So this has now been built generally. It's still a relatively young environment, but it is maturing quickly. And I think that's what's exciting about some of these types of projects is they get better over time, this idea of additive contribution to our urban environments as they get stronger year by year. And what I thought was really great about this design proposal was Studio Gang also thought about what was under the surface of the water. So again, we shouldn't think of ecosystems as ending at the water's edge. They actually are connected very directly to what is below the water. I wanted to just quickly show this project, Millennium Park, that I actually worked on. And it's not such an ecologically oriented park, but I thought because of its cultural benefits, it was interesting. This was a decking of a rail yard. So again, speaking to that topic I mentioned earlier about decking infrastructure, this was one of the first projects to do that. And this has now become one of the primary cultural spaces in Chicago. So that entire zone you see in the foreground, in the background, 23, I think it's about 23 acres or about 10 hectares. is now a new park. And so this is significant culturally with this bandshell by Frank Gehry, this curving bridge by Frank Gehry. And then also there was an opportunity in the left-hand side to bring back some of the native species. But again, primarily it's this wonderful cultural and social space that before was completely unused. Oops, sorry. So that's what it looks like today. It's growing in quite well. The last one I wanted to talk about is a project I've been working on in Utah called The Point. This is a 600-acre project, very large for the United States. We don't see a lot of big pieces of land like this come up very often for redevelopment. It's bounded by infrastructure, highways. It's an old prison site. So SOM was commissioned to do a master plan for it. And one of the first things we looked at was the scale of the site. And it actually lends itself very well to the idea of a 15-minute city. The center of the site is about a 15-minute walk from the edge. So the whole site was accessible within a 15-minute walk. So that was our first idea, was to make this a pedestrian-oriented community that would be active throughout the day and even into the evening. The second big idea we had for the site was what we call the river to range trail. So this is a unique part of Utah where there's a river system on the left and a mountain system on the right. So the idea was to connect these two together using this project. So that's become a very important part of the master plan. And here you see in the foreground that park system, and it extends up through the project and connects over to the mountains in the background. So it's biomorphic in that sense that it's reconnecting and restoring some of these original connections that have been lost. It's what we call a one-car community, meaning you can live here and only have one car, and there's other ways to get around. The streets are designed to accommodate these different types of transportation modes. And the open space system, which is shown here, actually was reimagined. So we moved away from this idea of traditional central parks and actually took the open space and spread it around the project. So you can actually get to every single parcel using open space as a transportation corridor. So that was, I think, a breakthrough in terms of how we thought about open space. So again, it's really trying to advance this thinking around open space, mobility, and how these two things are related. And then, of course, how people come together in these different environments. So this is the illustrative plan. So this is under construction. Actually, they're building now this central part of the project. Hopefully by later this year, they'll be building some of the roads and bigger pieces. So that's quite exciting. So just a few more images of the types of social spaces and granularity that we tried to create in the project. And I think finally at the end here, the scale of the project is actually a pretty low density development. The tallest building here is about 10 stories. But most of the buildings are 3 to 4 levels in height. So it just, again, comes back to this idea that these planning principles that I've talked about today are not dependent on high density development. Actually, they work equally well at low density developments. But the important thing is thinking holistically about the relationship of built form to open space and transportation systems. So I'll just leave you with this last slide that the challenges we're facing to planetary health are significant. And I think it's important that we all collaborate, share knowledge, and work together to address many of these challenges that we're seeing. So Maysho, that's all I have today. I'd be happy to take questions.
That's brilliant, Peter. That's right on the money. Tim, I don't know if you can turn my camera back on. It's saying that it's controlled by the host, but Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. Extremely enlightening, and you're exactly right. Let me see if my camera is working. No, here in in the Middle East, specifically in Saudi, and the project that we're working on, some of this is being thought of. I'm sure you've probably seen some of the imageries that are coming out of our urbanism. Have some of this. So, and I'm sure in Hong Kong as well. I want to encourage everybody to post questions that they might have. Sorry, I'm getting a thing. Please open again. I'm not sure what's happening. What does that mean? Okay, there it is. Okay. Peter, I have a quick couple of questions, and then we can probably we're going to go to the floor. And for me, it's those phases that you showed, phase 1, phase 2. And I was thinking, shouldn't there be like a fourth phase, which is sort of post implementation, and how do you monitor and adapt and control? On one of those slides, the process.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, actually, and it's one I've been getting a lot. Is how do you measure? How do you measure these ideas? How do you allow them to be, translated to specific results, specific implementation? I think that's really the next, stage in terms of how I and anyone else who's interested in this topic advance this. Is what are the benefits? How do you actually do it? And I think also, Maysho, a related question probably is, what are the economic what's the economic cost benefit of these things? So those are all really important questions, and I don't have a good answer for you today, but yeah, no, thank you for the suggestion. I think that could easily be a phase 4, which is measuring what you're doing. I think that's your suggestion.
Yeah, and I think you probably kind of grazed the other 2 questions that I have. Are there any downside? Again, I'm thinking of this here being very applicable in a project that I'm working on. Are there any downside to biomorphic and this sort of hybrid concept that you're talking about, if any?
I think the challenge is that most developers don't look at the world through an ecological lens, right? They look at it purely through an economic lens, and not purely, but primarily, or I should say first through an economic lens. Second, I think through a placemaking lens, and perhaps third through an ecological lens. So there is I think a gap between maybe some of these ideas and what's happening in the in the actual development community. Now, I think cities are maybe a bit more enlightened around these topics. I think we've seen in North America a trend towards a much more community-based planning. So more different voices being heard. This idea of social and cultural representation is extremely important now in North American planning. You basically can't do a project anymore without, a strong local input. So I think that's healthy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say the downside maybe is simply on the shared value of some of these ideas, right? So.
Yeah, and very debatable, by the way. Peter, I know there's some questions coming in here. Let's see. There are a couple here. I did lose internet connectivity. Believe it or not, I do live remotely, but I was able to read a couple of the questions. I'm gonna try to get those first, and then we can go back to the ones that are posted. And this is from Barry, if I must say. Is there a difference between old-fashioned landscape architecture and biomorphic urbanism. Is this, and again, I'm just remembering what was posted. Is this sort of a landscape 2.0, and does landscape architecture needs to update itself in this sort of in this space?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. There was, I think many of you may remember, I think it was in the 90s and early 2000s, this idea of landscape urbanism. And yeah, it's not dissimilar. There's a lot of parallels. I think perhaps what I've tried to do is, in a simple way to say it, is essentially merge some of the best ideas of new urbanism, which was heavily skewed towards, walkable communities, basically, and some of the ideas of landscape urbanism. And I think if we can work on both sides of the street, so to say, then I think our cities can be more successful. I think the problem with landscape urbanism, as I understood it, was that there really wasn't an attitude towards built form. It was more about simply about ecological ideas. So that's what I've tried to do, is just bridge that gap and say, we can talk about built form and ecosystem restoration. They are not mutually exclusive, and they should be talked about together. So that's really what this is trying to get to.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. I'm just going to fire these questions at you, and you can go off. What are the differences between biomorphic and biophilic design?
Yeah, biophilic design is, in my opinion, a general term, simply about what I call adding nature, additive, or being close to nature. And that can take many, many forms, having more houseplants or landscapes in our buildings, say living walls, green roofs. That's all part of biophilic thinking. It's really about the adjacency to nature. What I was looking for was, okay, that's great, and everybody or many people like that idea, but how does that actually shape our cities? And that was really what I was interested in understanding. So it's not enough simply to add nature to our cities, but how does it actually begin to restore ecosystem health? Because I do think that's one of the great challenges of this next 30 to 50 years is ecosystem health. So if that makes sense. You look a little quizzical, Maysho.
No. I'm trying to digest, and my one eye is on the question. So no, that's my challenge. No. So the audience, they are listening, and your response is mostly for them. So Peter, the next one here is biomorphic urbanism part of the ideas of new urbanism by Congress of New Urbanism, or is it another new thought?
Yeah, again, I think what's interesting about this is trying to take the best attributes of new urbanism, which has now been around for 40 years and has made a tremendous impact, I think, on our thinking about urbanization, in saying, what's the next generation of that? Okay, so that was all really interesting and useful. So let's build off of that. And how do we then begin to integrate some of these new demands, climate demands, ecosystem restoration demands, and cultural representation into some of those ideas of new urbanism? So it's in my mind not a new thing, but perhaps an evolution of these ideas that have been out there for a while.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. So here's another interesting one. Culture and nature are co-constituted according to political ecology. However, culture is embedded in power relationships, and very often a restored ecosystem will benefit those who can afford it. can biomorphic urbanism promote socio-spatial justice, restorative in terms of culture as well? A very, very loaded question.
Yeah, I think the issue of representation and power, it absolutely is related to these ideas. I think unfortunately there's been a trend or a perception that the wealthy benefit from these ideas more than, say, the less wealthy. But I do think these ideas, the idea of, let's call it ecological equity or environmental equity, does transcend power structures, and that poor people or people with less wealth or less power actually do benefit from these ideas over time. That's one thing we're seeing in the US in cities is what is this idea of environmental justice. You know, why are landfills always in poor neighborhoods, for instance, or why are neighborhoods that are lower income in areas, say, that flood frequently? So I do think there's a direct, and you actually see that in Asia too, in Jakarta, you know, some of the settlements, the poorest settlements are in the most vulnerable ecosystems or environments, right? Floodplains or coastal areas. So it's a complex topic. I can't say I have all the answers right now, but I do think it is a democratizing. It has the potential to be equitable. Some of these goals and concepts.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I was looking at your Utah project, and you guys put that sort of that green belt diagonal connecting.
Yeah.
But what happens at the edge? Are the neighbors and others allowed to freely come in and explore and experience? Again, it's not to be answered here, but it's those sort of conditions that could lend the equity that you're talking about. It's not a simple thing. Here's another interesting one. I'm sorry, go ahead, Pete.
Just on the Utah project, so all of those spaces are public spaces, and I think that's a interesting trend in the US is the idea of public space is a bit different than, say, Asia. Our parks tend to be fully public, meaning anyone can go in there at any time. Anyway.
Yeah. Other question, in your sort of your global outlook, how is this biomorphic sort of urbanism being received globally? Is it the governments and local council are embracing it, clients? What's sort of your global outlook on embracing this urbanism?
I think with any idea like this, it takes a while to be absorbed. So it's really still in progress, and I'm hoping to more formally summarize this in perhaps a book in the next year or so. But I do think it's applicable to many regions of the world, and that was one of the goals. Was how could we treat or approach a project in, say, Asia versus the US versus Europe versus the Middle East? What are the shared, what makes those projects similar, and then what makes them different? I think that's important to understand. So we're just not mindlessly repeating the same design solutions everywhere. But there's so I think the short answer is to be determined. I think there's different levels of reception in different places. And again, it's not that these ideas are particularly new. Many professionals around the world are implementing many of these ideas already. It's really about trying to codify or clarify some of the concepts here.
Yeah, and I know we're at the time, and the other thing as well, everything is localized as well, and with certain modification. It's not one band fits all as well. So there's a little bit of that. The culture is so drastically different. Middle East, Asia, North America.
Right.
Tim, I don't know if we're going to be shut off at 5, but there's one more I would like to ask, if I can. It'll probably take a minute, but it says, how do you view biomorphic urbanism relationship with an ecological footprint?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Every environment has a location.
Oh, that's from Aaron.
Oh, you can say it. Okay, good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I know Aaron from here on the west coast of the U.S. Yeah, it's a great question. What is, I think the idea of his question is there a maximum ecological threshold?
Yeah.
I think there is. I'm not sure how to determine what that is. But I think that would be part of maybe coming back to your original question, Maysho, is on the implementation side. How do you scientifically determine, for instance, what is the carrying capacity of a particular region or ecosystem? And that's where, maybe some of the technological advancements that we're making around agriculture or ecosystem restoration, urbanization, transportation come into play. Can we build more efficiently, more compactly, that allows us to raise that threshold? So that's a great question.
Excellent. Peter, there are many more questions coming in, and certainly we have run out of time, so we'll stop it there. And maybe if Tim can, he'll forward those questions to you, and we can find somewhere to post it into a group. Thank you so much, Peter. Really, really appreciate it. On behalf of the HKIUD, very enlightening, and we look forward to seeing this being developed, and hopefully we can learn more and help contribute actually to the movement. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for everyone joining us. Tim, thank you. Thanks.
Have a great day, everybody. Thanks so much. Bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.